Old case spanning almost 3 decades in Barry County is coming to a close today.
The sheriff's office says 3 men were arrested in connection to the 1999 death of Justin Hokut of Seligman.
The 14-year-old was last seen alive the morning of October 9th of 1999. About 22 hours later, his body was found on some train tracks near his home.
In May, the Barry County Sheriff asked the Highway Patrol to assist in the investigation. Investigators did not believe the death was an accident and resubmitted evidence for new lab testing.
Mark, Bobby, and David Scott are all in custody facing murder charges. Bobby and Mark are being held in Little Rock, Arkansas. David is in Barry County.
Today, authorities say witnesses who were previously afraid for their lives are now cooperating and coming forward.
In Barry County, I'm Shannon Becker, KOAM News Now, Joplin News First.
For nearly 27 years, the death of 14-year-old Justin Hokut was tied to a stretch of railway tracks in Seligman, Missouri. He was last known to be alive on the morning of October 9, 1999. Less than a day later, his body was discovered on those tracks near his home after being struck by a train. At first, it looked like a terrible accident, but there was a problem. The story of how Justin supposedly got there never completely made sense. Why would a 14-year-old boy walking home take that particular route? What happened to him between the time he left a neighboring home and the moment he ended up on the railway? And perhaps most importantly, was Justin still alive when he reached those tracks? For years, those questions remained unanswered. Then, nearly 3 decades later, investigators reopened the case. Old interviews were examined again. Evidence was sent for additional laboratory testing. Witnesses were interviewed again, including people who investigators believed might have known more than they originally admitted. And in July 2026, the case took a dramatic turn. 3 brothers, Mark Wesley Scott, Bobby Ray Scott, and David Ray Scott, were arrested and charged with Justin's murder. But investigators didn't say one miraculous DNA discovery suddenly solved a 27-year-old mystery. Instead, they described something much more complicated. A case rebuilt piece by piece from fragments that had survived for nearly 3 decades. And at the center of all of it was the same question that had haunted Justin's family since 1999. What really happened to Justin Hokut before he reached those railway tracks? Before we go deeper into Justin's story, subscribe to Crime Vault. Here, we follow cold cases where forgotten evidence, renewed investigations, and witnesses who finally come forward can change everything. Because sometimes, the biggest breakthrough isn't one piece of evidence. Sometimes, it's what happens when investigators finally put years of scattered information together. Before Justin became the center of a nearly 27-year murder investigation, he was simply a 14-year-old boy trying to grow up. His aunt, Tammy Tolbert, remembered him as a young boy who loved animals, rode his bicycle, went to the movies, spent time with friends, and collected baseball cards. Those details may sound ordinary, but that is exactly what makes them important. Justin's life wasn't defined by the railway tracks where he died. It was defined by the things he enjoyed, the people who knew him, and the future he never got to experience. His family kept his photographs, belongings, and baseball cards, small reminders of a boy who should have continued growing older. For several years, Justin had lived with relatives in Pea Ridge, Arkansas. Eventually, he moved to Seligman, Missouri, where his father and grandparents lived. He had not been there for very long. He was attending Southwest School, becoming familiar with his surroundings, and making friends in the neighborhood. According to the information later included in the investigation, Justin was also seeing a teenage girl who lived next door. And that neighboring home would become critically important to the case. Because on the morning Justin disappeared, he wasn't at his own house. He was there. Sometime between approximately 4 and 5 in the morning, according to the probable cause statement filed decades later, someone inside the house discovered Justin and the girl together. What happened after that would eventually become the heart of the investigation. But in 1999, the story investigators initially heard was much simpler. Justin had supposedly been awakened. He was told to leave. He put on his shoes. Then he walked away. That was supposedly the last time anyone saw him alive. But if that account was accurate, Justin should have been heading back toward his father and grandparents' home. He never got there. Approximately 22 hours later, his body was discovered on the railway tracks. And that's where the first major question emerged. Why were the tracks involved at all? Justin's body was found on the railway near his home after being struck by a train. The impact had severely disturbed the scene. That created an immediate problem for investigators. Some injuries could have resulted from the train itself. But what, if anything, had happened to Justin before he reached the railway? At first glance, the accident theory was possible. But the more investigators considered the circumstances, the more difficult that explanation became. Justin had no alcohol or drugs in his system. There was also nothing indicating that he had been suicidal. The accident theory depended heavily on one basic account. Justin left the neighboring home alive and walked away. But years later, that account would be challenged. And when it was challenged, the entire meaning of the railway tracks changed. According to the later probable cause statement, Justin had not simply been sent home. Investigators alleged that an assault occurred inside the neighboring residence. One witness described Justin being struck and kicked. Another described a rope being placed around his neck. Other accounts mentioned objects that may have been used during the assault, including a stick, cane, or baseball bat. The details weren't identical, and that mattered. Nearly 3 decades had passed. Investigators had to determine which witnesses had personally seen something, which had only heard information from others, and which details may have changed as memories faded. But if the later accounts were accurate, Justin may never have walked away from that house under his own power. And that changed everything, because the railway would no longer simply be the place where a boy somehow wandered before being struck by a train. It could have been the place where someone deliberately brought him. And that raised an even darker question. When Justin reached the railway, was he already dead, or was he still alive? For years, one theory suggested that Justin might have been killed somewhere else and then placed on the railway tracks. The train would then have destroyed or obscured evidence of what had happened beforehand. Some former investigators reportedly believed the limited blood found near the impact area could support the possibility that Justin had died somewhere else before being placed on the tracks. But the later investigation presented a different conclusion. According to the probable cause statement filed against David Scott, the doctor who performed Justin's autopsy determined that Justin was alive when he was placed on the tracks and struck by the train. That distinction is enormous. If Justin was alive when he was placed there, then the railway wasn't merely being used to hide a body after a murder. Putting Justin on those tracks became part of the event that ultimately killed him. But there is an important limitation. The complete autopsy report has not been publicly released. What is available publicly is the investigator's summary of the doctor's conclusion, not the complete medical analysis itself. That means the exact medical evidence behind the conclusion remains something the court may have to examine. And the autopsy question wasn't the only problem. Investigators still had to determine what happened inside the neighboring home. The original account said Justin was awakened, told to leave, put on his shoes, and walked away. Later witnesses described something entirely different. They alleged Justin was assaulted inside the home and removed without leaving under his own power. By that point, investigators faced a difficult reconstruction. There were essentially 2 important locations: the house where Justin was allegedly attacked, and the railway where the train struck him. The challenge was determining how those 2 locations were connected. The original railway scene had already been disturbed by the train. The neighboring residents had not initially been treated as the obvious starting point of a murder investigation. That meant investigators were working backward years later, trying to reconstruct what might have happened before Justin reached the tracks. There was another complication. Many of the people connected to the case were connected to the residents of the neighboring home. Years later, Sheriff Danny Boyd identified a weakness in some of the original interviews. Several interviews had been conducted inside the homes of possible suspects. That could matter. The environment in which someone is questioned can influence what they are comfortable saying, particularly if people connected to the investigation are nearby. Then time added another layer of difficulty. People died. Memories changed. Physical evidence remained in storage for years. And the case had already been reviewed more than once. Additional interviews were conducted in 2009, 2010, and 2011 after new information surfaced. But none of those efforts produced a murder case. Investigators appeared to believe that people knew more than they were saying. Yet suspicion wasn't enough. They still needed evidence. The case remained caught somewhere between unanswered questions and proof. Then, in 2020, Danny Boyd became sheriff of Barry County. Justin's case became one of his priorities. But Boyd wasn't starting with a fresh crime scene. He was starting with a file more than 20 years old. A file containing witnesses who were now older. A file containing people who were no longer available to interview. And evidence that had been sitting for years. So investigators started again. They reviewed old reports. They went back through previous interviews. They examined the route between Justin's home, the neighboring residence, and the railway. And then they discovered another potentially important detail. Some evidence apparently had never been examined by the state laboratory. That evidence would eventually be sent for new testing. But not immediately. The case still needed something more. It needed people. In May 2026, the Barry County Sheriff's Office requested assistance from the Missouri State Highway Patrol's Division of Drug and Crime Control. Evidence was sent to the State Crime Laboratory for additional examination. But investigators weren't claiming that modern forensic science had suddenly produced the answer. There was no announced DNA match that instantly identified a killer. There was no single laboratory result that suddenly explained every unanswered question. Instead, investigators went back to witnesses. The Missouri State Highway Patrol reported that investigators were following credible leads, and they appealed to anyone who might still know something about Justin's final hours. Sergeant Bradley German said investigators believed people still possessed important information. Between February and May 2026, investigators conducted another round of interviews. Then they compared those statements with interviews taken back in 1999. And slowly, something started to change. Not because one person suddenly confessed, not because investigators discovered a perfect forensic fingerprint, and not because one piece of DNA solved the mystery. Instead, details scattered across decades of interviews began to overlap. For the first time, investigators believed they could begin constructing a sequence of events. And that sequence led directly back to the house where Justin was last known to be alive. The renewed investigation didn't produce one flawless witness. It produced pieces. Some people said they had seen what happened inside the residence. Others said they had heard something. Still others described conversations that allegedly occurred afterward. The accounts didn't always match perfectly. One witness described seeing Justin surrounded during an assault. Another recalled sounds that suggested a fight inside the residence. Different witnesses mentioned different objects. A stick, a cane, a baseball bat, even a cast iron skillet. Investigators weren't necessarily trying to force all those accounts into one identical story. Instead, they were looking for details that remained consistent across separate statements. That is an important distinction. Because nearly 27 years later, investigators could not simply assume that every remembered detail was accurate. They had to compare the accounts, look for overlap, and determine which elements were supported by more than one source. One particularly disturbing allegation concerned what happened after the assault. The probable cause statement describes a rope being placed around Justin's neck. There were also statements about taking him toward the railway. Then there was another detail investigators had to examine. Bleach. One witness said several gallons had been purchased around the time Justin died. Years earlier, former Detective Brian Martin had described a vacant apartment in the complex that smelled strongly of bleach and reacted during luminol testing. But there was a problem with interpreting that evidence. Bleach itself can cause a luminol reaction, so the smell and the test result could raise suspicion. But they did not, by themselves, prove that blood had been cleaned from the apartment. Investigators also collected statements about what people allegedly said after Justin's death. Some involved alleged admissions by members of the Scott family. Others concerned conversations between Harold Johnson and Brenda Scott. Again, investigators had to distinguish first-hand information from hearsay. That distinction could become extremely important in court. Former Detective Brian Martin was also revisited. According to the filing, Martin described what one witness had reported during the original investigation. That gave investigators another point of comparison. What had the witness said decades earlier? And how did that compare with what investigators were hearing nearly 27 years later? Slowly, the separate accounts began to point investigators toward the same basic sequence. Justin was confronted inside the residence. He was allegedly assaulted. He was badly injured, and he was then taken toward the railway. The witnesses did not agree on every object. They did not agree on every detail. But investigators believed enough of their accounts supported one another to take the case beyond simple suspicion. The original story had been that Justin walked away. The new theory was much different. Justin may have been taken, and if that was true, someone had to answer for how he ended up on those tracks. By the summer of 2026, investigators believed they had enough information to seek arrest warrants. 3 men were named: Mark Wesley Scott, Bobby Ray Scott, and David Ray Scott. All 3 were charged with first-degree murder. But there is an important distinction in the publicly available information. The allegations against David Scott are described in considerably more detail in the probable cause statement. Investigators accused David of taking part in the assault, beating, stomping, or striking Justin with an object. They also alleged that he helped coordinate moving Justin toward the railway once Justin became incapacitated or unresponsive. If prosecutors pursue that theory, they will have to establish what David allegedly did, what he knew, and how his actions contributed to Justin's death. The publicly available material is less specific about the individual conduct attributed to Mark and Bobby. Both faced the same charge. But being charged with the same offense does not automatically mean investigators allege that each person played exactly the same role. Those distinctions will matter, because an arrest is not a conviction. A probable cause statement establishes the basis for an arrest. It does not establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That determination belongs to the court. In July 2026, Mark and Bobby Scott were arrested in Arkansas. David Scott was arrested in McDonald County, Missouri. He was later transferred to the Berry County Jail and booked on July 23 under a first-degree murder charge. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, the case that had once appeared to have stalled was moving toward a courtroom. But there was still one major obstacle. The state would have to prove what happened. For nearly 27 years, Justin's family had no courtroom answer. They had photographs. They had his belongings. They had school memories. They had the baseball cards he collected as a 14-year-old boy. But they didn't have an explanation for how he died. His aunts, Paul, Aaron, and Tammy Tolbert, kept his memory alive through years of silence. Over the years, they heard rumors. They received messages from people claiming to know what happened. But some accounts could not be verified. Others contradicted one another. And the years kept passing. 20 years. 25. Nearly 27. Justin remained 14 in their memories. He never got older. He never finished school. He never added another baseball card to his collection. He never had the opportunity to discover what his adult life might have looked like. Then, in July 2026, 3 men were arrested. For Justin's family, those arrests brought something they hadn't experienced since 1999. Movement. Not certainty. Not justice yet. But movement. Tammy Tolbert said the family had wondered whether anyone would ever be held accountable. Now, after almost 3 decades, the allegations were finally moving into a setting where evidence could be examined in court. And that is where the next chapter of Justin's story begins. The arrests are significant, but they don't answer every question. The court will still have to determine what happened inside that neighboring house. Who participated? Who knew what? Who took Justin toward the railway? And what happened when he reached those tracks? The court may also have to evaluate witnesses whose memories stretch back nearly 3 decades. Some describe what they claim to have personally witnessed. Others repeat information they say they received from someone else. Those are not the same thing. The court will have to decide what evidence is reliable. It will also have to consider the claim that Justin was alive when he was placed on the railway. That conclusion is based publicly on an investigator's description of the autopsy findings, because the complete autopsy report has not been released. Then there is motive. At this point, a clear public motive has not been established in the supplied case material, and the investigation remains active. That means additional developments could still come. More evidence could emerge. More witnesses could speak. Additional charges or arrests could potentially follow. But for now, Mark Scott, Bobby Scott, and David Scott have been charged. They have not been convicted. The state still has to prove its allegations against each man beyond a reasonable doubt. And that is an important distinction, because after nearly 27 years, the goal isn't simply to identify people and make arrests. The goal is to establish what actually happened to Justin Hokut. Justin was 14 years old when his life ended. His family never got to watch him grow into an adult. They never got to see where life would have taken him. For years, his death was associated with a railway and a devastating accident. But nearly 3 decades later, investigators say they believe the story was much darker. They believe Justin's final hours may have begun inside a neighboring home. They believe he may have been assaulted. They believe he may have been taken toward the railway. And they believe the evidence gathered across decades is now strong enough to place 3 men before the court on murder charges. But the court, not the headlines, not the investigation, and not public opinion, will ultimately determine guilt. For Justin's family, however, the arrest brought relief after nearly 27 years of uncertainty. They finally have the possibility of an answer. The charges cannot restore the life Justin lost. They cannot give his family back the years they spent waiting. And they cannot, by themselves, determine what happened. But they create something that didn't exist for most of the last 3 decades. A path toward a courtroom. A place where old testimony can be tested. Where evidence can be examined. Where contradictions can be challenged. And where, eventually, the question that has followed Justin's family since 1999 may finally receive an answer. What happened before Justin Hokut reached those tracks? For nearly 27 years, that question remained buried in an old case file. Now, it is back in the hands of investigators and the courts. Justin Hokut was 14. His family never got to watch him grow older. But after nearly 3 decades, they may finally have the opportunity to hear what happened to him. If you want more stories about cold cases where forgotten evidence, renewed investigations, and witnesses who finally speak can bring an old mystery back into the light, subscribe to Crime Vault. Because sometimes a case isn't truly over. Sometimes the answers are still waiting. And sometimes, after nearly 27 years, the investigation finally begins again.